Today we are finally diving into world building, which I think is a thing we're both very passionate about. JC and I have taken some time to put together 13 different elements that we look at anytime that we're creating a world for homebrew. We're going to briefly cover them in this video to give you guys some idea of what we consider, but we'll be making a series after this to go into each one of those in depth. Here at Dungeon Brew, we are about to release our first large crowdfunding project on BackerKit. It is Thagum. It is a new campaign setting manual that gives you a grim, dark steampunk world. Over 200 plus pages that's going to have new subclasses, new lineages, new weapons, gritty firearm mechanics, new feats, new monsters, city guides, and so much more. And we are looking for you just to go and follow the page right now and be ready for that launch. So follow the link, go check it out, and then come back to the video. So JC, if you'd like to start us off with, where do you typically start when you begin to build a world for a homebrew campaign?
Invariably it's going to be what is an inspiration. What is something that has sparked enough of my interest to get me excited about world building? It can be, for a campaign, it can be for writing, it can be for whatever. It may be something that I was reading. It could be a show or a movie that I watch. You and I both have a huge amount of interest in history, and oftentimes I find that as a very big source of inspiration. Recently I was actually kind of looking through some historical stuff, and I came across the Greeks, specifically like Agamemnon, and I was thinking about a campaign world that would be kind of like Greek in nature, especially around the time of the Trojan War, where there's a lot of travel back and forth over the Aegean Sea and that type of thing. So anything like that can really drive world building, especially if it brings your interest on board.
Yeah, absolutely. I do the exact same thing in terms of looking for the influence first and then building my world around that. And typically after I kind of have that inspiration piece that starts driving me, then I start thinking of my genre or my theme that I'm going to build this world to reflect. So you and I know both kind of lean towards dark fantasy, but there's other things to look at as well, whether or not it's low magic or high magic, or if you're building the city-state concept that you're talking about among the Greeks and how they're interacting with one another, or if it's highly built around like seafaring and trade and those types of concepts as well, or if there's wars, if there's a lot of gods involved within that world or a few gods involved in that world, whatever the thematics kind of look like and how it's built around a genre, I think is the next thing that I look at, especially if we're looking at dark fantasy versus high fantasy, looking at steampunk versus low tech, whatever the case may be.
Right, and that gets into like the geography, right? I know you and I have talked about this before, but I often find myself drawing a map very, very early on in the process. And if we're talking about something like a Greek culture or Greek inspiration to drive me there, it's going to be something that is very close to the sea, probably a lot of islands, and a lot of different cultures kind of sprinkled around those islands or sprinkled around those coasts. And you end up with a different feel for the world that you're trying to build if you're building it around something like a seafaring culture or a seafaring campaign. It looks different there than it would if you were inspired by something like Russia, like the Russian landscape with the Ural Mountains and the tundra where it's very cold and icy. So you have to keep that in mind whenever you're thinking about the world building that you're wanting to do.
No, I am the same way. I have to build a map. Like, I can't even build a campaign without having a map in front of me. And I think part of that is the fourth piece that I usually look at revolves around culture and where cultures are located. And I have to have that visual of the map to know where to place them at. Where are my elves living at? Where are my dwarves living at? Where are these city-states in this Greek-like culture actually located? And how do each of one of them differ based on their traditions and their routines and their holidays and the gods that they worship, how the pieces of their city kind of intertwine and function together, and how they build just celebration and understanding in general with that. But culture, I think, is the next big piece that I really try to consider in looking at that world building piece, and how each one of the cultures that are in my world interact and engage with one another. So again, with like the Greek campaign, you may be looking at the Athenians versus the Spartans versus others that are in the region, and how they interact and engage with each other, and how that defines them as individuals. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, and it does. And the way that culture is expressed for any of them. So you're talking about like the Spartans, talking about the Athenians, talking about the Trojans. Even the Egyptians would fit into this. But those cultures also have to do, and their locations and the geography, all of those things together start to determine population. Not only population for individual cultures, but population, world population. And sometimes that has to do with the time setting that comes in. Like there are other factors that determine population. But what you want to consider is you want to consider how that feeds into it. Earlier time periods are probably going to have lower populations. Later time periods are going to have higher populations. There are a bunch of other factors that we can play with there. But considering that is going to inform a lot of the other things that are going to follow, and back and forth. And you're probably going to find as we start going through the rest of these ones, or the rest of our list, that there's definitely a sense of pick a piece, look at it, and then pay attention to it in relation to all of these other pieces. Because it's not just checking off the list. It is looking at this item. How does that item relate to the next item? How does that relate to the first item? And so on and so forth. So, but population is really, I think, one of the first ones on that list of how does this fit in with everything else.
Yeah, after these first 4 or 5 have kind of been like established for me when I'm building a world, the other ones like can be flipped around in any order. It's kind of, you and I were talking about earlier about like this zooming out, zooming in process of trying to build the world. And some of these hold more weight based on the campaign you're about to run than other ones do. And so your focus may shift or change. One of those pieces that you may look at next is magic, though. And this is probably, not something you can necessarily look back throughout history for influence and find magical influences and how that plays into your society, though maybe it does in some retrospect. We know that the Greeks, for instance, were heavily influenced by the Egyptians, something you mentioned earlier, and how their ideas around magic and burial and things may impact them. But magic is a thing that you're going to want to consider on how that plays into your world. And I've done campaigns that are very low magic, where there's very few magic items and they're hard to find and it's rather rare and it's almost looked down upon from major places where there's civilization that's growing, where government officials and stuff come after you if you have any type of interest in magic or you talk about magic or you dabble in it. Where I've also done campaigns that are very high magic, where they're on a constant pursuit to find magical crystals and items that influence your gear and your standing and your power in the world. So magic is one of those elements, I think, that goes into world building too, and how much you want to have it play a part for your characters in the campaign.
Right, and of course the other side of that coin would be technology. So you have magic on one side, how high or how low magic is, and then how high or how low, how advanced or how far behind, I guess, technology would be. Generally, you tend to find in a lot of fantasy settings that it's usually low technology, high magic, or low magic, high technology. You can have a balance of that. You can have both. You could have high magic and high technology. There's no reason why you can't. And there's also that notion, and I can't remember some of the places where I've seen this, but the idea that you have certain cultures that are high magic, and then usually something like humans or gnomes or dwarves are high technology in response to that. Like they don't have magic, but the way that they're able to compete on the world stage is because they're high technology. But determining your technological level in a campaign setting in a world that you're building, technology is a huge piece of that. It helps you to establish the state of the world in terms of what is available and what is not available for the poorest class of citizens. By and large, what do they have access to?
Yep. After that, I'd probably look at religion, which is a huge piece, I think, for me, especially when I'm building campaigns. Religion always has a large part to play in my campaigns and how they're put together. and you just want to determine for yourself how much of a role religion plays into the world that you're creating as well. Using the Greeks as an example, we know that they were a polytheistic society for the most part. They were heavily influenced by Judaism as it was moving into monotheism. So in your world, you have a monotheistic religion that's challenging your polytheistic civilizations and cultures that are scattered around the world and how that influencing it. Another interesting thing about the Greeks is that they were known to not necessarily shun people based on their belief systems or their religions, but they would try to incorporate them and adapt them into their own understanding of the cosmos and the world and the spirit world and the soul and all those things, and kind of adapt them and adopt them into it. So how do you work that into this vision of being influenced by this Greek culture and wanting to create a religious element within your world building too? I know that's just one of the many examples, but for many folks that play D&D, there's countless books and chapters written on religious elements in D&D that are already pre-made, and if you want to create your own that are based off of something, you just have to determine how much do you want that in your world and having it influence your characters and the overall campaign.
Right. And we talk a lot about, like, we're talking about Greeks as an example because it's something that's very close to both of us in terms of, influences and that type of thing. But the other piece, especially when you're talking about religion, is religion is almost the perspective of the cultures of what the cosmos hold. But as a creator of that world, you are directly in control about what the reality of those cosmos are. So you have everything from, a real world kind of notion that there is, the cosmos are infinite, but we don't know what lies beyond, and you can only speculate, to the Forgotten Realms D&D notion where there are actual planes of existence that you can travel between and experience, especially in regard to things like elemental planes and planes of positivity and negativity of hells and heavens and all those types of things. Establishing and understanding those things can help your players understand, like, scope wise, is this the only world that exists? Is this fantasy world an isolated world, the way that we see ourselves in our own world? We can speculate what's out there, but we don't really know. Or is it something where there's regularly interplanar travel? Gods come down from Celestia or Olympus in this case in order to visit the world. You have Tartarus and whatever, and Hades and those places where evil or chaotic creatures come up from below. What does that look like beyond just what the material is, and how do you get into those other levels of existence?
It's funny that you're talking about the big picture stuff, and I was just talking about how we zoom out and zoom in, because my next thought is, like, city life is like the next element that I would sometimes consider in terms of world building, because that's what makes it so real for a lot of the players, is when you kind of go into that microcosm of day-to-day life and what it looks like as they're traveling through cities and taverns and inns, and they see the people really living all the things that we're talking about. You see them living their culture, you see them engaging with technology, you see them practicing or praying to their gods, you see them having conversations about the cosmos, you see them engaging or shunning magic in some way, shape, or form. And I oftentimes think about, like, the NPCs in that city life that characters are going to be engaging with, and what are the most commonly held beliefs and practices that my characters are going to witness and be able to engage with in that, and how do I make that be a real aspect to the gameplay as well, and having just a really clear, crisp picture of how that day-to-day looks for the NPCs that are populating the world.
Yeah, and the funny thing is like this, when you think of city life, you think about what you experience, you think about the active market, you think about all of the things that, all the things that we've talked about up to this point. You have the technology of the magic, what is available, and from that perspective, we're talking about economics. We're talking about the economic state of the world. What is the value of a dollar or a gold coin or a silver coin or whatever. And anybody who's been looking at some of the stuff that I've been putting out recently on Patreon know that that's kind of an obsession of mine, because I'm completely rebuilding the economic system for my next D&D campaign. And I look at things like what is considered to be the most valuable and what is considered to be of less value. And this gives your players a sense of value in the world, because what a suit of armor costs versus what a loaf of bread costs versus what a warhorse costs, all of those things limit or allow the experience of not only NPCs in the world, but also, like I said, the characters, the people who you're trying to pull into it. Because if a suit of armor is available at level 1 versus only available probably at level 3 or level 5, because it's so expensive, it's such a high commodity item, it really influences what the world is like and what the sense of value is. This is especially true if you're talking about something like a Greek culture, where the primary the primary metals in use are something like bronze. You don't really have access. I mean, steel is not going to be accessible. The idea of a steel weapon is something that is on the magical level. This is something that is so far ahead in terms of technology that it could be considered to be magic by them, because they may not understand its construction or the way that it's put together. But that also means that it's highly valuable and it could drive the economy.
Yeah, I have a similar obsession with economy too, and a lot of what you're talking about also has something to do with like that community level economy, but I also like the economic pieces that are large. Like, is salt being traded across the seas, and how does that influence the overall city and its wealth and those types of things? So those are great points to be made. Another thing that I have an obsession with is the political piece as well that I put into world building. I love playing with politics. I love testing out different belief systems and practices in order to kind of like oversee the masses in my world and have different cultures experience different types of things so my players can see that. So, you know, one city-state in this might have a Congress, have a republic, or have a Senate. Another one might be a complete totalitarianism that's overseen it. Another one might be more of what we see as being like a republic democracy. And you can play with those different elements as well and have conflicts in between these different city-states in this particular world we're building that are challenged by the different political systems that are being used, and how that really causes intrigue for the characters throughout. But I love the political play, whether it's noble classes, serfdom that you have going on, more of an aristocracy or an oligarchy that's taking place in the cities, and just really sitting down and determining how that looks for each one of the cultures that's been built.
Right. And the last one that we have on our list, which is by no means the last one that I arrive at. In fact, it's probably one that arrives earlier on the list. But like we mentioned, these are all kind of interchangeable after you get to a certain point, because you're going back and forth and back and forth. But the last one we're going to talk about is military. And you can kind of see, I would hope, just even with this brief overview at this point, that things like magic, technology, economy, politics, all of those things, geography, all of those things play into the military. If you're talking about something like a Greek civilization, they were highly skilled at travel at sea. Their navies were extensive because they were necessary in order to be able to travel across the Aegean, in order to be able to access other points of interest. There was no way for Agamemnon to reach Troy if he didn't have the ships necessary to carry his soldiers. And that, to me, kind of, it is, military really is an expression of all of those things. And it's interesting because if you have an idea for what you think the military should look like, for instance, it drives a lot of what the other things are going on in the world. It drives what the technology level is like. It drives what the magic level is like. It drives what politics are like or economics are like. All of those things are driven by military if you arrive at what you want the military to look like first, and vice versa. It's really necessary to kind of have a multi-scaled option where you're kind of like putting in pieces here and there and here and there in order to establish what those things look like on a larger scale.
I know we promised 13, but as you're talking, I thought of a bonus 14th that could probably be talked about as well.
Yeah.
And that's history.
Right.
The history of the world, the history of the dynasties, of major battles, of major famines, of major events that have taken place, and how that has added flair to the world or shaped the world in some way, and kind of outlining little small pieces and bits of that. Now, I will admit that history probably is one of the last things that I get into to some regard, because I do have to know some of these other things in order to understand how those things were shaped. What the military is, what the magic looks like, what the religion looks like. It's probably very rare that I start with history, but I do think it's an important piece to world building.
Right. History is something that grows along with everything else that you're doing. And I think one of the first things I was talking about was time. Like, what time period is this? How many ages have passed? As you put these pieces together, you're going to find that you have built a history, because it's impossible not to. You can't talk about what the political struggle is between two nations if you don't talk about the history that exists between them. And that's true of almost every single element on the list. You don't end up with the geography that exists in the world without time passing, without history. Otherwise, we would still be on Pangea. All of those things come into play, and you have to think about them on that scale over time as you're building the other pieces.
Well, I'm curious if anyone watching the video has any other elements you feel like we might have missed, or any components you think we should have added into this list. But we will be coming together and making a video about each one of them to explore them a little bit more in depth and let you know how we create those for our own world building in our campaigns.
Judge and Brew.